classroom, and I'm your host, the African history teacher, Professor Hicks. And welcome to another broadcast. And our hopefully final, I want to say hopefully, but our final broadcast on the Stono Rebellion, Black Resistance. So today we're going to give some of the details and we're going to give you the story. I'd like to first acknowledge some folks. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the person who's giving us the story today. And his name is, I'm going to get the book label. You might have seen this on Facebook. Black AF History by Michael Harriot. Wonderful storytelling book. I advise it emphatically that you pick up this book, particularly those who want to stay on the peripheral of history and its making, who wants to get a snapshot or a clear picture, brief clear picture of slavery incidents. This book is highly recommended. Today, we're going to take our final story of the Stono Rebellion from Michael Harriot's book. So we'll get to that in a few moments, but let me just present you with a few other books that can help you if you're into this subject and want to pursue it any further. The next book is Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. Capitalism and Slavery. This gives you an economic breakdown of how the Europeans were able to underdevelop the Caribbean islands as well as some other nations, but it gives you a background or a detailed analysis of the underdeveloping economically of the Caribbean islands, America, and a few other places. Okay, here's another one by Gerald Horne, Race and Revolution. This gives you an actual, a clearer picture of the revolution and how slavery helped shape the revolution and subsequent signing of the Declaration of Independence. Again, we're doing this whole series regarding the upcoming semi-quincentennial, which celebrates 250 years of American independence, starting from 1776 to 2026, July 4th. That will bring us 250 years of this particular nation. Then another book by Patriarch Scanlon talking about slave empire. Now, I haven't done a lot of reading in this one. I've been using it for reference, but based on my referencing it, it seems to be a very good book. And finally, Caribbean History by Tony Martin. This is another great reference book to get information from a glance, and then it also goes into deeper research. So if you want to get a glance and then go deeper, it gives you the pages to pursue deeper into this issue. Okay? All right. Okay, now you got it. Okay? Yeah, I hadn't done that in a while, and I wanted to do it because I think it's important that if you're going to take these books and use them as a teacher or professor or guide, by someone who's guiding you, I think it's important so people know the books that you can take and get this information from, as well as I did. All right. So, just a quick political update. We understand that the president or the king went into Nigeria and bombed a place or a town in Nigeria. And subsequently, we find that the people he was pursuing, ISIS and Boko Haram, that there were none of them there. And the residents of this town say that the Christians and the Muslims lived together in harmony for centuries. So where did the king get this information? Where did he get the information that it was okay to go into Nigeria? And based on what I'm hearing, Tinubu, who is the president of Nigeria, I understand he allowed this to happen. Now, if you know anything about the president of Nigeria, he's not so happy with the Sahel coming together, or the organization, the AES, and that is Niger or Niger. Who else? And several other countries that slip my mind right now. But you guys have heard of Ibrahim Toure, all right? He's the great hero that led Mali out of subjugation by the French. So, the European powers are upset with him and those who associate with him. So I believe getting to Nigeria militarily is a step for the Americans to leave their footprint in Africa again, because they've been pretty much, as Africa is concerned, they have not been there as hard, or should I say as strong as they used to be. But I believe that Trump is taking the first step into trying to regain some of the foothold in Africa that they lost. So yes, this bombing in Nigeria, like the bombing in Venezuela, has no precedent, no precedent first, and has no real substance to it, because there are no Christians being killed, and that was the impetus of the strike, was that Christians were being killed. But as I said to you before, the townspeople at this location have said that they live well with the Muslims. So Trump, another blunder, and of course he's picking on the African nations now. Ask yourself, why do you think he's leading himself to push back on African nations? Yes, you know why. Because we're always the weakest link in the chain. All right? If you remember 2 weeks ago, he was planning to go into Venezuela, right? He was going to bomb him. He was going to this and do that. Now you haven't heard any talk about that, right? You wonder why. One of the things about Americans, one of our talents are how easy we forget. And that's why we're so easily manipulated, because we don't remember anything from day to day. What was an event yesterday is lost news today. And I believe our government depends on that from us, from the populace, to forget incidents as they go. But he was going into Venezuela, right? Well, how many people are aware that in the Atlantic Ocean at this present time, there are two Russian strike submarines that are fishing around in the Atlantic, along with several other Russian sponsored, how would you call them, I guess, aircraft carriers. Yeah, they're all mulling around in the Atlantic near Venezuela. You know why? Because Venezuela has an agreement with Russia. Yes, because they supply Russia with oil. They have an agreement with Russia for protection. All right? So Trump is not stupid. He knows those submarines. So does the mainstream press, but they won't tell you that. So I don't watch it. Yes, there are submarines and other anti-warcraft, or should I say warcraft machines, or whatever you want to call them. What would we call them? I'm trying to get a good name. I don't want to overexcite anybody, but let's just use the word armaments, okay? Yes, they're standing ready in the Atlantic, poised and ready to protect Venezuela. So you've noticed that the president, his attention now has shifted to Africa, because he's a big punk. He's a big punk. He always blusters about what he's going to do, but he's not brave enough to do it. All right? But he has somebody behind him that is, and that's the military-industrial complex. All right? And that's his guideline. So thank God, there's only been one strike in Nigeria. We don't know what's going to happen after that, but I like to see how the president in Nigeria, because he's getting a lot of criticism now for allowing the Americans there, and we'd like to see what happens with that. All right, so that's the political news for today, and we're going to move on and get deep dive into our subject, the Stono Rebellion. So the Stono Rebellion occurred on September 9th, 1739 in South Carolina near the Stono River. The date is September, and it was a Sunday, and Sunday is significant that this took place. As I mentioned, the location was near the Stono River, about 20 miles south of Charleston. If you're familiar with South Carolina, I am. I have a lot of family there. All right, so they're about 20 miles southwest of Charleston. Now, who was being attacked by these black folks? The British colony. Remember, at this time in 1739, Our country that we call the United States today is just a bunch of colonies. They're not a state, and they're British colonies, owned, of course, by the British. So the British colony, with one of the largest enslaved populations in North America at this time, and that place is called South Carolina. South Carolina imported so many slaves for their rice cultivation that there were more slaves in South Carolina at this time than there were Europeans. So who led this rebellion? Well, the rebellion's leader was named Jimmy, and sometimes he was called Cato. Excuse me, folks. I'm sorry. So the leader was named Jimmy, sometimes called Cato, and of course he was from Angola, Congo regions. Well, you know there's going to be a problem, right? So who participated in this rebellion? About 20 at the start. So when Jimmy's about to lead this rebellion, as he's making his way south towards Spain, he's picking up people who are hearing him and, of course, listening to him, who he's advocating to join him. And again, he started about 20, but he wound up about anywhere from 60 to 100 because as this rebellion is moving forward south, it's gathering strength by those people who want to be free. Now, many of the people who started this were from the Congolese Central Africa. Moreover, they were Christian, they were Catholic, and most of them had military experience. Some from their own engagements, war engagements with tribal enemies, or sometimes with conflict with the Portuguese or the Europeans, but they gained this experience. They were also, unlike many slaves who came later, familiar with firearms and firearms formations. All right, the Europeans had the Napoleonic formation of strategy of war, and that simply meant you take all your people, you line them up shoulder to shoulder as long as you can, and you fire. You don't duck, you don't move, you just keep moving forward, and that's called the Napoleonic strategy of war. And that's the way the Europeans fought. They didn't fight in guerrilla warfare. They stood toe to toe almost, with rifles pointed at each other, no one ducking, no one kneeling, and firing. Okay, that was their form. Well, the Africans found out how to work this as well. All right, so what were the causes to this rebellion? Well, one of the causes was the extreme, brutal conditions of rice cultivation. Now, let me take a moment and explain this to you. First of all, rice cultivation in the Carolinas was discovered by African women who were noticed by one of the plant overseers or one of the masters that the women in South Carolina who were cultivating rice and stuff, he realized that they were feeding themselves, that they were fine, but the Europeans who were the masters weren't getting much rice. Well, what happened was these black women were just creating rice for themselves. How did they know how to do this? Because in their culture, in the Congo, as well as Southeast Asia, were one of the largest rice producing places in the world. The problem was trying to produce rice in South Carolina was very, very difficult. But these African women figured out a way, and they hadn't told the white master yet. But the white master noticed that they were pretty fat while the white masters were getting pretty skinny. Well, they observed what was going on, and sooner or later, sometime during that time, they figured out what these black women were doing. Now, what did that do? Well, after finding out how these black women were growing rice cultivation in South Carolina exploded. And along with the cultivation exploding, what do you need to cultivate it? African people. The slaves exploded. As a result, during this time, 1739, you had more slaves in South Carolina than white people. The ratio was somewhere near 10 to 1 in nearly all parts of South Carolina. Yes, the greed of the Europeans was as such that they brought more of the enemy into their camp, into their plantations, without even thinking about what the consequences were, or they didn't care because of what? Arrogance. So we're talking about the causes. So one of the first causes was extreme brutality of the rice plantations. Women, children, and men were branded. Branded. Women were branded on their breasts. Men branded on their back. Some were branded in their faces. They had what you call slave devices, slave punishment devices, not just for the men, but for the children. Yes, they had devices that they gonna put a little kid's fingers in and smash it down. They had another device that they could put for women and men through their lips, where they would burn a hole with a iron spinster or something, bend it through the mouth, up through the nose, and put a lock on the lips so they couldn't talk, because communication was very valuable. Sometimes babies were fed to alligators in certain parts of Louisiana and Florida by these horrible, sick people. That's why when you hear some of the horrible, violent acts committed on white slavers and their children, you can't get too crazy with it, because what they did to our babies and our women, the brutality on these rice plantations, were something inconceivable. First of all, I should mention that first of all, but last of all, I should mention that the cultivation of rice also brought a lot of disease, particularly yellow fever and malaria, because standing water is not good. Even today, if you have a standing water in your backyard, you want to move that water because mosquitoes are attracted by it. As a result, these mosquitoes, of course, would attack the people who are cultivating, mostly Africans. So the mortality rate of Africans on these farms was maybe 3 to 4 years, not even that. No one grew to an old age on these plantations, and specifically these rice plantations. So the extreme brutality that occurred on these plantations was one of the causes to this rebellion. The second cause was the high African to white ratio, 2 to 1. A third cause was that Florida, and I continue to mention that the Revolutionary War was a global war. But another cause to Jemmy and his boys, the rebelling, was that the Spanish who were in Florida, remember the Spanish at this time owned Florida, as the French owned certain parts of Canada, the Spanish promised freedom to any slave that came into its domain, meaning Florida, they would be free. Of course, the Americans didn't like this, because even though they were competing against the Spanish, both countries had rules that they recognized, okay? Like, I wouldn't take your slaves if you don't take my slaves. But of course, no one played by the rules. And as a result, the Spanish made a decree in 1733 offering freedom, land protection if any slave made it to Florida. Another cause that should be mentioned is the African military tradition. These men were trained militarily in their own traditions and in the Portuguese tradition or European tradition. So standing by being a slave was not something that they were going to stand for. There are so many slave uprisings between the Caribbean and the Americas that there are not enough pages in the world to record them. So when you hear people say, like one man said to me one day, well, black people never fought. They just went, with their heads bowed into slavery. Another racist lie. I can fill up one book with the slave rebellions that occurred. And we're going to go through that. I'm going to go through more slavery, but this is one of the most important ones. All right. But one of the causes was the African military training. They knew that they could win. They could win a quick war or a quick battle. Another thing that causes war was the intelligence of these Africans, particularly Jimmy. See, because Jimmy could speak a few languages, but we'll get to that to his story in a moment. So Jimmy knew that this was a very good time to strike on this Sunday. Why? Because most white folks were at church. And if they're at church, that means they couldn't patrol where they were. So there were fewer patrols because the whites were at work. So what happened on this wonderful, and I call it a wonderful Sunday? There's always this movie I used to watch and say the Native Americans always said, well, today is a great day to die. And yes, there are great days to die. particularly when you in a repression or oppression, and you're not really living anyway. So this day was a good day to die. So let's see what happened. At daybreak on Sunday, September 9th, 1739, 20 or so Africans gathered at the Stono River, about 20 miles south from Charleston. I gave you that already. At least 19 were from Angola. 19 of the 20 were from Angola. And their acknowledged leader was a man named Jimmy. Some call him Cato, C-A-T-O. Despite being thousands of miles from the West African region where he was born, Jimmy had a warped familiarity with the environment, the climate, the soil, and the topography of South Carolina were similar. The reason why he had familiarity with it because it was similar to his hometown of Congo. Yes, South Carolina, if you've ever been there, could be easily substituted for some place in Africa. All right, so at this time, only 15,000 of the state's 45 citizens were white. All right, so one more time, I'm sorry to fumble that up. At this time, only 15,000 of the state's 45,000 citizens were white. So 15,000 of 40 only are white. So even in America, Jimmy was surrounded at this time by mostly black faces. Imagine being in South Carolina at this time as a slave, particularly a rebellious slave, and you see more of your folk around than the white folks. Unfortunately for you, most of the white folks are carrying guns and you're not. But numbers can mean something, as we will see. Jimmy was surrounded by black faces. His status as a warrior, a fearless leader, and a fellow African convinced his co-conspirators that they could overcome all the wrath and retribution that all the white gods could summon. They held the power. Before his capture, Jimmy could not have foreknown or fathomed such an inhumane institution as the enslavement system that lay beyond the horizons of the African coast. Even though there was slavery in Africa, America's version was intergenerational, unending, and by definition reduced humans to a form of animated chattel. Although he was now a bondservant who was likely literate in at least 3 languages, which he was, including English, Portuguese, and his native tongue, some historians believe that Jimmy probably served as a Congo or Angolan warrior who was captured and sold during an incursion with neighboring kingdoms. So historians believe that Jimmy was, as I've been saying, a captive during tribal wars or state wars, because in this part of the Congo you have more states than you had tribe societies. So he might have been captured. He could have been captured by another African tribe or society, or he could have been captured at one of the many wars with the Portuguese. But nonetheless, he had already been recognized in his community as a leader, a warrior, an intelligent warrior, and brave and not afraid to die. Not afraid to die is the key here, folks. That's the key. He was also likely trained in combat, strategy, and the tactics of war. Jimmy was a leader. Yes, he was. He was a man. He was a human being. Above all, Jimmy was not a slave. Plus, Jimmy knew things. Jimmy knew that a recent malaria outbreak had decimated Charleston. Now remember, malaria and yellow fever are being almost produced by the cultivation of rice. White folks at this time were very leery about even going into the slave quarters or near slaves. South Carolina had a different type of slave system than many of the other southern states. It was called a tag system. And we'll get back into that a little later. But let's go on with Jimmy and his story. So we already mentioned that Jimmy was linguistically gifted. And he knew a few things. One of the things he knew was that there was a recent outbreak that had decimated Charleston. His linguistic flexibility allowed him to communicate without fear of the uneducated white men who knew nothing of rice or cattle. Now, remember, rice cultivation was something that the Africans in West Africa had already practiced for thousands of years. But something else they did very well, and that was cattle raising. They were expert cattle raising. For example, when the white folks wanted to gather the cattle that would, kind of go out their way in the field, they would use whips and more physical activity, where the Africans had a different perspective. Okay, they knew how to use dogs, they knew how to use language, they knew how to corral these animals without very much effort, particularly as compared to the white folks. So yes, he knew something about cattle and he knew something about rice. This ability to speak Portuguese meant he probably understood the Spanish agents sneaking through the plantations, spreading rumors that enslaved people would be free if they could make it to the free black community of Fort Mose in Spanish Florida. Jimmy, the rebel, knew that the healthy white Charlestonians would be in church on Sunday for the annual feast of the Nativity of Mary. He knew that South Carolina had just passed a law that required every free white man to carry a firearm because he could read, he could understand English. And he always, of course, I'm sure, like many of us, who feigned that he didn't know anything. But Europeans, in their arrogance, always thought that black people were dumb and stupid. I mean, it's one of the reasons why Harriet Tubman was able to be a spy during the Civil War, because all the white folks who talked around her thought that she was so dumb and so dumb that she couldn't understand what they were saying or what they were doing when it came to war. But she fooled them, didn't she? As we've always fooled them. Let's go back to Jimmy. So as I said, Jimmy the rebel knew that the healthy white Charlestonians would be in church on Sunday for their annual feast of the Nativity of Mary. He knew that South Carolina had just passed a law that required every free white man to carry firearms. He also knew that the law wouldn't go into effect for 2 more weeks. He knew a just God, would eventually give him his freedom, and he knew that the white man never would. So this goes back to what I was saying last night, that these slave rebels were never afraid of dying. This is another arrogant assumption by the white folks at this period of time, because they weren't not afraid to die. So all the horrible tactics that they did to torture us didn't work, never did, never does. Not to people who want to be free. But Jimmy could not wait for God or the white man to free him. He didn't just want to be free himself. No, Jimmy wanted everyone to be free, and Jimmy had a plan. Jimmy's crew met before daybreak on September 9th, 1739 on a Sunday, and knew exactly where they were going. After crossing the Stono Bridge, they broke into a hardware store and the armory that sold guns and munitions right next to it. They executed the 2 shopkeepers, decapitated them, confiscated their firearms, and kept things moving. The group proceeded to the plantation owned by Godfrey's family, killing the owner and his 2 children. When they arrived at Wallace's tavern before dawn, they didn't murder the innkeeper. Why? Because according to Jimmy and the co-conspirators, Wallace was a good man and kind to his slaves. He would be the only white man spared, though. By daybreak, the makeshift army had traveled only 3 miles of the 150 to Fort Mose. So we can almost surmise what happened. And yet, the group had doubled from 20, probably now to about, maybe about 600, about 100 rather. Some of their newly emancipated cohorts had joined voluntarily, while others were conscripted into teaming up with the rebels to keep the news from spreading. By 11 o'clock, somewhere between 60 and 100 Africans were on the prowl, flying a banner playing drums, dancing, and chanting. Liberty! 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 People who were lucky enough to escape the group's wrath reported that the rebels were drunk, unaware that war dancing was a form of communication in West African military traditions that had survived by embedding itself in the Gula Geechee culture. Yes, not only did these Africans fight violently, but they fought politically, yelling liberty, 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 understanding the European's language and using it against him. This call for liberty had to permeate some ears, and someone had to suggest to themselves, who was white, that these Africans ain't so dumb, are they? By late afternoon, after traveling 10 miles, the troops paused in an open field before crossing the Edisto River, likely calculating that the word of their previous handiwork would cause other enslaved Africans to join their ranks during the night. They weren't worried about being caught. They had killed every white man who laid eyes on them, except for one, who spotted them just before noon. They chased him, but he was on horseback and escaped. But unfortunately for them, this one guy who got away was William Bull, the Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina. When an impromptu white militia summoned by Bull found the free slaves, a battle broke out. 20 whites were killed, and at least 30 of the black militia died, while others were captured, imprisoned, and interrogated. The murdered insurgents were decapitated and their heads affixed to posts entering the city, a practice that would become an American tradition. The incident inspired fear across Carolina. For months, wives and daughters of slave owners were moved out of the state. The state assembly raised a special patrol along the Stono River and offered rewards to natives if they captured escaped Africans, but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. So let me read that again because it's important. That they went to the natives, the Indians, and offered them rewards to help capture us who had escaped. But fortunately for us, the Native Americans did not bite. One of the initial 20 leaders remained at large for 20 years. The Stono Rebellion changed the face of slavery in the slave capital of the world, which was South Carolina. Remember, South Carolina is directly across from the Caribbean islands. So not only did they have slaves coming from Africa, but they also were trading with slaves with all the other great nations of the time, meaning France, Spain, and Great Britain. See, even though the Americans were a separate colony, even though they were a colony from Britain, they constantly competed against Britain. They constantly fought against Britain for whatever resources they needed. For example, one of the most hated rivals or one of the most hated enemies of Britain was France. But the American colonists traded with France most of the time in Charleston Port, which was one of the largest shipping ports in the world at the time. So when the French came into Charleston, even though they were enemies to the mother country, Britain, the American colonists or the British colonists traded with them, helping out the enemy, in other words. So this global war that we're going to soon call the American Revolution has so many different protagonists and different people who were from not what we will call the Americas. For example, the British and the Spanish. So this conflict between Britain and its colonists was also a conflict with colonists and Spain, colonists and France, and of course colonists who were fighting their own home country, Britain. Very important to understand that. This is why during the Stono Rebellion, Jimmy and them concocted this rebellion because they knew if they made it to Spanish Florida, they would be safe. Where the 1733 decree had stated that they would get freedom if you could make it here. So let's get back to Jimmy. And I already mentioned, but I'm going to read it again, that the incident inspired fear across South Carolina. For months, wives and daughters of slave owners were moved out of the state. They even raised a militia patrol just to patrol the Stono River. They incorporated the Native Americans to help them do this. The second part of this Stono Rebellion, we're going to talk about the psychological ramifications of rebellions in general, this one in particular. Because what we're reading here, that the incident inspired fear. What they're not saying is that this incident inspired a little more than fear. All right? This incident inspired an emotional and psychological breakdown for these slave masters and their families. And we'll talk about why later. As I said, the Stono Rebellion changed the face of slavery in America and the slave capital, particularly by proxy in America as a whole. As a result of it, now these are just some of the things they're mentioning. We're going to talk about something they're not mentioning. As a result of it, whites temporarily paused the slave trade in South Carolina for a decade. Yes, this is the fear that Jimmy and his Stono Rebellion pals instilled in these people. To this day, this is why we have Europeans shooting our kids so quickly, because they have always been afraid of us. They see us, we strike fear into them for many reasons, but we do. Some of them are afraid of us and never even met us. I've heard white folks claim that they are afraid of black people, though they live in all white communities and have never seen a black person in their lives. This fear, this is where it originated from in the Americas only. So they paused the slave trade for a decade. Yes, South Carolina found another way of getting slaves because this Stono Rebellion shook them. They blamed the violence on the fact that these rebels were born in Africa. Well, that's some of it. But I think the violence was mainly based on the fact that you got me enslaved, sucker. You're killing me. You're killing my women, my children. How dumb are these people? I don't know how we allow these people to become the dominant group in the world. I do. I shouldn't say that. I'm being facetious. Because I know the only thing that they have, that they could do well, is make guns. This is not a people that ever use their minds to do anything but to subjugate other people, massacre them, kill them, repress them, and then ultimately take their resources. That's what these Europeans have been doing for the last 2,000 years. But you can't do harm to people without harming yourself. Psychological impact of these slave rebellions we're going to talk about. That's our next topic. So the whites blame the violence that these guys were from Africa. Yeah, that's somewhat true, but that's not all. In its wake, white entrepreneurs formed a new industry by creating American-born slaves. This is where we get the buck camps. All right? The black buck camps. The buck camps, B-U-C-K, were camps where African men and selective women were put together to have slave children. And the best of us were put together to do that. It was also used to inseminate black men by having sex or having anal intercourse with a slave, of the biggest and the toughest, while the other slaves looked on. Why would someone do something like that? To denigrate them, to effeminize them, to take away their manhood, and so that all can see. So just imagine, folks, set your mind into South Carolina plantation, and there on the floor is splayed out a young black man, big strapping black man, and then on top of him could be another slave or either the white man having anal intercourse with him in front of all the slaves as a means to subjugate him to nothingness, to a piece of nothing. This is what they did. These entrepreneurs traveling around because of this rebellion, forming and creating American born slaves. Masters encouraged reproduction among slaves they already owned, while slave traders traveled the country buying human beings from estates, buying human beings from auctions, and buying human beings and indebted slavers. So I'm in debt, I'm going to sell you some slaves so I can get out of debt. When the transatlantic slave trade eventually reopened, they avoided the Congo Angola region because the geniuses concluded, these idiots concluded, it wasn't the brutal idea of perpetual intergenerational human bondage that caused Jimmy and his friends to lash out. Apparently, it was the geography. Just kidding. Perhaps the most significant legacy of Jimmy's war were the draconian measures. Now, this is why we're going to get into this psychological, epigenetic legacy that has lasted on both groups, the enslaved and the enslavers. Yes, both of us were affected by these rebellions. Perhaps the most significant legacy of Jimmy's war were the draconian measures the legislature put forth to replace South Carolina's 1696 slave code. The post-Stono legislation forbade slaves from growing their own food, earning money, learning to write, or gathering in groups 3 or more. It prohibited black males. Let me stop right here. In South Carolina, as I mentioned, they had a different type of slave system. Slaves were able to go out, rent themselves out to the other owners. Slaves were able to read the Bible mostly. Slaves were able to go out from the plantation, walk around and do their thing. They could learn to write if they wanted to. They could gather in groups. These were all things that South Carolina slaves could do. Some of this was because of the outbreaks of malaria and yellow fever, where the Europeans didn't want to go near the slaves, so they allowed them to finish their work. After their work was completed, slaves were allowed to meander and go where they want. But this was before Stono's rebellion. It prohibited black males from traveling together in groups of 7 or more without the presence of a white man. When I was a kid, I used to get arrested for something called unlawful assembly, when me and my gang would stand on the corner of one of the Bronx neighborhoods, and the cops would come on and they arrest us all. And then we all of a sudden found out about a law. We found out about a law called unlawful assembly. This is where the law came from. The controlling the behavior of African slaves. This law was mimicked throughout the entire United States, like most laws. This law not only prevented them from traveling, but it also gave owners the right to kill any enslaved person who was rebellious. Up to this point, you couldn't kill your slave. It was a dumb thing to do anyway, all the money you paid, but you couldn't arbitrarily kill slaves until now. They went so far as to regulate the colors and fabrics that enslaved black persons could wear. It was a legal code of complete and total oppression. Because white people were the minority, South Carolina's white population used cruelty as a tool to suppress their worst fears. Total genetic annihilation. Francis Cress Welsing. Total genetic annihilation. This is another element, maybe one of the largest element in the fear factor that white folks have of us, particularly white men. Genetic annihilation. They know that they are the smallest populated group on the planet. White folks are a minority on the planet. They know this. They grow up with this. In order for them to survive in their twisted mind, they believe they have to get rid of us, particularly black males, for more reasons than just us being able to physically dominate them, but because of genetically, we can have a lot of thousands and thousands of kids and they can't. We can continue to reproduce but they can't. That's why you find in Europe, particularly Italy right now, you have a zero growth rate of population. Germany, London, all of the major centers right now, European centers, are having population decline because Europeans cannot produce. And Europeans, moreover, refuse to go out of their race to produce. Because if they did, they might be able to turn around. But that would mean that they will be turning dark in a few generations. So they're not going to do that. So as a result, just like the South Carolinians did, they're bringing more Africans into there. Or should I say the Africans just going there? The Africans say, okay, I'm going to London. You guys destabilize my home, I'm going to London. And as a result of that, these populations in London and Germany and Italy, their populations are declining. Africans now, you can find black ball players who are now calling themselves Greek, calling themselves French. Why? Because their ancestors have been there now for generations. You know, these large influx of immigrants to Europe started about 25 years ago. That's a generation. And now they produce more. And they're becoming the largest population in many of these centers that I just described. So this genetic annihilation is happening right in their home front. But they knew it here in 1739, and they knew it now. They know it now in 2025. All right, so let's close. I lastly mentioned that South Carolina's white population used cruelty as a tool to suppress their worst fears, genetic annihilation. Nearly every state's law governing the enslaved were based in part on the Negro Act of 1740, proving that the uniquely American version of human subjugation was never just a thoughtless experiment. It's like the American Revolution was no thoughtless experiment where everyone says, oh, you repress me, give me my liberty, give me liberty or death. No, the American Revolution was fought because of slavery, because these patriots knew that the British government was about to embark on abolition. They knew about the Somerset case. They knew about Africans being armed by the British to fight in the Caribbean. They knew Africans being armed to fight in India. They knew that the British were arming Africans. And that made them think about what will happen to their profits in the next 15 or 10 years. So in 1739 or 1740, after the Stono Rebellion, they created this Negro Act. And these laws were handed to every state in the Union or in the colonies. And each one of these states or colonies reproduced these laws. It was ingrained in the fabric of America, these laws. It was intentional. A color-coded, never-ending, legally protected, constitutionally enshrined system of human trafficking that extorted labor, intellectual property, and talent in the most brutal way imaginable. It was born out of fear and white supremacy. And yet, with all the enlightened philosophies, the whips, the muskets, this country, whatever horrible act you can think this country could muster, one thing it could not do, it still could not make a slave. And that is the story of the Stono Rebellion. Now let me give you some particulars to that story, okay? Now that story was taken out of, and just want to give the brother props, so get the book, read it. Let's talk about a few of the things, and we're going to end our program. We're already into 49 minutes, almost all long one, Hicks. So let's go by a quick step-by-step what happened here. So we talked about the immediate causes, Spanish offering freedom to blacks at St. Augustine, Florida. You might have been driving by there and saw that today. The African military traditions, the causes, and the timing for Sunday. So weapons were seized by the rebels who broke into what you call Hutchison's store. That was the name of the proprietor of the store. They killed the shopkeeper. They took guns, gunpowder, and ammunition. They organized a march south towards Spanish Florida. They beat drums, carried a banner, and chanted liberty. That's the political aspect of this strategy. They burned plantations, they killed some enslavers, and spared others. Enslaved Africans joined along the route, reaching from the number of 20 to eventually to 100. The militia confrontation. The South Carolina militia intercepted them. Fighting occurred over several hours. Many rebels were killed, survivors were captured and later executed. The casualty count was about 25 whites killed, 30 to 50 Africans were killed. Others were executed afterwards. Heads of rebels were displayed on posts as a terror warning when you entered the town. So why did this rebellion fail? Of course, we can think that they were outnumbered and outgunned by the militia. You should know that the South Carolina militia you should know that the police department and our current National Guard were the precursors to the militia. The militias were the precursor to them. Slave patrols, which were created first in South Carolina, were used to create the police departments. Same thing, same responsibility, same attitudes. All right, you got a bunch of uneducated white folks walking around in uniforms at that time. Uneducated white folks riding around on horses, trying to pick out people and kill them and bring them back into slavery. All right, so they were outnumbered and outgunned. The militias, which had formed in South Carolina, were eventually used, by the way, to win the Revolutionary War. Because when the northern folks in New England, when they were being attacked by the British, they didn't know how to react. They didn't know anything about militias. So they went to South Carolina and got training. Yes. And then they were able to bring that training back to the New England states and continue to fight the American Revolutionary War. All right, to finish off with why the rebellion failed, we talked about they were outnumbered, outgunned. There was no fortified refuge reached. So if they had gotten to Florida, to Fort Mose, M-O-S-E, which was in St. Augustine, Florida, they might have been able to survive, but they had no place that they could go to have as a refuge. The communication gaps as the march expanded. So just think about it, folks. You start out with 20 people and you're marching, you're gathering more people as you go along. Some of them you don't know. Some of them might be speaking a different language. So the communication, as most things do when they get large and expand, the communication from the center command probably failed. So you might have had Africans who didn't even speak English or didn't understand Portuguese trying to be coordinated by Jimmy, and Jimmy maybe did not speak their language and could not communicate with them in the normal way that he would. So that communication gap probably helped to decentralize the rebellion and scatter them into factions. And we should mention as one of the final causes that the colonial militia response was swift. So what was the immediate aftermath? The Negro Act of 1740. This act singularly reduced us to real chattel slavery. It banned literacy for enslaved people. Remember I said they were, at that point, you could still learn to read and write in certain plantation quarters. They banned any type of assembly that we would have, meaning getting together or gathering. Earning money was restricted. Movement, your regular movement, manumission, meaning that you could outlive slavery based on maybe your offspring. Slave patrols picked up, and militia power became very, very, very important to every city, or I should say colony. All right. The long-term significance was it was a militarized Southern society. Yes, even to this day, the Southern patrols and this Southern society is militarized. One of the complaints of the British when they started the American Revolution with the Americans, that those Americans all had guns and that those Americans could really shoot well. Yeah, they trained on us. The long-term legacy is shaped racial laws. race hardened into legal caste system, caste, like they have in India. You know, in India, you're born, if you're poor, you're born poor. You're poor for the rest of life. Nobody, you cannot make it up to the next level. You're in a caste. Look it up. What this also did was influence later revolts like Denmark Vesey's revolt in Charleston, Gabriel Prosser, not Turner, one of the biggest and best. And it connected to the American Revolution. How did this Stoner Rebellion connect to the American Revolution? I'm sorry, the American Revolution. It's instilled fear. It instilled fear that Britain would arm enslaved Africans. Go back to the global war stance. Enslaved Africans were already fighting with the British in Caribbean places and sometimes in India, some of the other colonies they created. They had already created African slave patrols, the British. They had not yet created one in America, but they did in the British Caribbean islands that they own, Jamaica and so forth, and they used those free slaves, I call them slaves anyway, free slaves to fight against their brothers. All right. How does this, remember the point is, how did this connect to the American Revolution? Fear of Britain arming enslaved Africans. Southern elites lean towards independence to protect slavery. What does that mean? Well, prior to the Stono Rebellion, most Southerners were leaning towards the British. They supported the Royalists. They supported the British. Why? Because they were selling all their slaves to the British in the Caribbean. Not only slaves, but they were selling trees and carpenter and wood sources and other resources that slip my mind right now. But there were so many. Rum was one big source. Tar was another resource. Ropes and riggings for ships were big trade resources that the Americans had plenty of and were trading with other countries. Those Southerners were down with the British at first. But after the Stono Rebellion, they began to take on the independence movement or independence from England, because they kind of hinted and saw that Britain was about to arm slaves and was arming slaves, and they became pretty frightened that they would lose their cash cow. All right, so why does it matter? Why does Stono matter? It proved that enslaved Africans could plan, organize, fight politically and militarily, and demonstrated that liberty was not an abstract as it actively pursued. It exposed a contradiction. If there's nothing else, it exposed the contradictions at the heart of American freedom, and subsequently the Declaration of Independence signing. Okay, folks, we're pretty much out of time, and I've probably given you too much, but we're going to go through this one more time, just a bit, and then we're going to move on to the epigenetics of slave rebellions. How did slave rebellions affect those people who were enslaved, and how did they affect the people who were enslaving? That's what we're going to talk about next. So without further ado, I'm going to say